Welcome to our Sunday School Bible study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, January the 12th. It's our second lesson in this study theme, God's Good Character. And this week our lesson is entitled God's Jealous Love. We're in the 34th chapter of Exodus. The first 14 verses is our focal passage there. And we're going to see that God is compassionate and gracious, but He's also a jealous God. Over the past few weeks, we've studied how Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and we've seen a lot of miracles that God performed there. Last week, we saw them get to Mount Sinai and receive God's law there. We were in chapter 20 in Exodus. Chapters 21 through 23 detail a lot more specific laws and ordinances that the Lord instructed Moses to pass along to the people of Israel. Exodus 24, verses 3 and 4 describe the moment when Moses communicates God's law to the Israelites. And the people's collective response was one of obedience and commitment. All the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do, they said. Moses then writes down the words of the Lord, ensuring that they are preserved and can be referred to by future generations. That act of writing down those laws kind of formalizes the covenant between God and the Israelites. Additionally, we see Moses building an altar at the foot of the mountain, and he sets up 12 memorial stones, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this altar kind of serves as a physical representation of the covenant, and it's a place for offerings and worship. The 12 stones symbolize the unity and identity of the Israelites under this divine covenant. Starting in verse 12 in chapter 24, Moses received some additional instruction from the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on this mountain and stay there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandments which I have written for these instructions." So Moses got up along with Joshua, his servant, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. But to the elders he said, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a legal matter, have him approach them." And then Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. And he was there for 7 days initially, and then it tells us down in verse 18, Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went up to the mountains, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Chapters 25 through 27 tell us how the Lord instructed Moses in the building of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. The instructions there are very detailed. Chapters 28 and 29 then deal with the priestly line of Aaron and his sons, and it details their garments, how they're to be consecrated, the sacrifices they're to offer, and the procedures. And then finally there's a section that deals with the food of the priests. Exodus 29:44, right at the end of chapter 29, says, "I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar. I will also consecrate Aaron and his sons to serve as priests to me. And I will dwell among the sons of Israel, and will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God. who brought them out of the land of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. Chapter 30 has instructions for making the altar of incense and the bronze bowl that the priest used for washing. And then the remainder of chapter 30 deals with the anointing oil and the incense and all of the things surrounding that. Chapter 31 is a very interesting chapter, I think. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all kinds of craftsmanship, to create artistic designs for work in gold and silver and in bronze, and in the cutting of stones." And then he goes ahead and says, "And I myself have appointed with him Oholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan." So all of these instructions that Moses has received from the Lord about building all of these different things that are involved in worship, God now says, "I've called out two specific people that are very skilled here and will take care of that building." In chapter 32 and 33, we have the very familiar story of the golden calf. At the end of chapter 31, Moses is up on the mountain there. And so the scene shifts back here in chapter 32 to the Israelites down at the foot of the mountain. And it tells us that when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled around Aaron and said, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us from the land of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him." And so Aaron acquiesced to their request, and he had them to bring their gold rings, and so they brought all this gold, and he melted it down, and he made this golden calf. And he said, "This is your God, Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." So he made this golden calf image. Now, we studied in chapter 20 last week the Ten Commandments, and one of the clear instructions there is no idols, no graven images. So the Lord told Moses, "You need to go back down there because the people have behaved badly. They have turned aside from the way that I commanded them. They have made a cast metal calf and have worshipped it and have sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God Israel who brought you up from the land of Egypt.'" So Moses went down from the mountain, and he's carrying the 2 tablets of stone that God had written the 10 Commandments on. And when he got down there, he was so distressed and so upset by the fact that they had built this golden calf that he threw the tablets from his hand and shattered them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. So the next day, Moses said to the people, "You yourselves have committed a great sin, and I'm going up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." And Moses returned to the Lord and said, "This people has committed a great sin. They've made a god of gold for themselves. But now if you will forgive their sin, very well. But if not, please wipe me out from your book, which you have written." So Now, however, the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will wipe them out of the book. But go now, and lead the people where I told you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, on the day when I punish, I will punish them for their sins. And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. In chapter 33, we have a significant moment in the Israelites' journey as they prepare to resume their trek to the Promised Land. God instructs Moses to lead the Israelites to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says an angel will go before them to drive out the inhabitants. Due to the stubbornness of the Israelites, God states that he won't go up in their midst to avoid destroying them. He'd be so upset, so angry with their behavior that he would destroy them. So this brings mourning among the people, and they remove their jewelry as a sign of repentance. Moses sets up a tent outside the camp. It's called the tent of meeting, where anyone seeking the Lord can go. And when Moses goes into the tent, the cloud, the pillar of cloud descends, and the Lord speaks with Moses, face to face here. Moses expresses his concerns to God, seeking assurance of God's presence with them. And God reassures Moses that his presence will go with them, providing rest and distinguishing them from other nations. At that point, Moses requests to see God's glory, and God agrees to give him a glimpse. He explains that no one can see his face and live, and so he makes provision to hide Moses in the cleft of the rock, and he can see his back as he passes by. So that brings us up to chapter 34, which is the focus of our lesson today. So let's read verses 1 through 8. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 stone tablets like the first one, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablet which you broke. Be prepared by morning. Come up Mount Sinai in the morning and stand before me on the mountaintop. No one may go up with you. In fact, no one should be seen anywhere on the mountain. Even the flocks and herds are not to graze in front of that mountain." So Moses cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones. He got up early in the morning. Taking the 2 stone tablets in his hand, he climbed Mount Sinai, just as the Lord had commanded him. And the Lord came down in a cloud, stood with him there, and proclaimed his name, the Lord. The Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses immediately knelt on the ground and worshiped. The command to cut 2 tablets of stone is one of the great demonstrations of God's mercy. When you think about it, the people had completely disobeyed and rebelled against God just a very short time after they had pledged their allegiance to him. But despite the failure of the people, he was willing to begin again with them. Once more, he would instruct them concerning his righteous way. So God instructs Moses to be ready by morning, indicating the importance of the encounter and the need for Moses to approach with reverence and readiness. The specific timing of morning, many see signifying a new beginning and the renewal of the covenant relationship between God and the Israelites. So Moses is to present himself before God at the top of the mountain, emphasizing the direct and personal nature of this divine meeting. This encounter is part of the process of receiving the new tablets of the covenant after the golden calf incident. Just like we saw in chapter 19, there was preparation for this encounter with God. And again, we see the warning, no man shall come up with you. And that was meant to protect the careless or the curious who would die if they trespassed on holy ground. So, since Moses had broken the former tablets, the first tablets, we saw that in chapter 32, verse 19, they were the work of God. It was appropriate that Moses would chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first one, and he obediently followed the Lord's instructions. He prepared 2 new stone tablets, and the next morning he brought them to the Lord on top of Mount Sinai. The Lord once more appeared before Moses and proclaimed his name, the Lord. We usually translate it Yahweh, Y-A-H-W-E-H, there. If it's and verses 5, 6, and 7 here describe an epiphany, the appearance of the Lord in his grand descent to encounter humans. At other times, the people saw the cloud, but here he comes to Moses. And the Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord. The Lord is a compassionate, gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love and truth. So verse 6 here reveals to us these attributes of God as he proclaims his own character to Moses. That verb there at the start of verse 6, the Lord passed in front of him, that's the same verb that's used in Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, when it says that Abram passed through the land of Canaan here. So as the Lord moved by Moses, he proclaimed the meaning of his name. You'll remember when Moses had the encounter with God at the burning bush, God explained this to him. I am who I am. I am. Tell them I am sent you. And so as he reveals his gracious character in this unforgettable manner, this verse is a foundation for understanding who God is. The words merciful and gracious convey the idea of overwhelming graciousness there. Compassionate and gracious God in the translation that our lesson material uses. Slow to anger. Some of your translations say long-suffering. And the idea of that Hebrew word is that God is very slow to anger. In our language, our idioms today, we would say he has a long fuse. The Hebrew word for goodness there means loyal love. Faithful love is the way it's translated in our lesson material. That's that word we talked about a couple of weeks ago that's used over and over in the Old Testament to describe God's sacrificial, loyal love. Hesed is the Hebrew word there. The word for truth means faithfulness. and constancy, reliability. So these attributes emphasize God's loving and just nature, and they provide comfort and assurance to his people. They're foundational to understanding the character of God in that context of his relationship with the Israelites and his covenant with them. In verse 7, we see a reiteration of what we saw last week in chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. But the order is changed for emphasis here. He says, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. That part was last in Exodus 20, and the part about he won't leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generation. That was the first part in Exodus 25 and 6. So the point here, the point that's emphasized here, is that God is more willing to show his mercy than his wrath, and yet his wrath is very real. Psalms 90:11 says, who understands the power of your anger and your fury, according to the fear that is due you. So he says, maintaining faithful love for 1,000 generations. That's a long, long time. 3 different words are used here in verse 7 for the wrongdoing that he describes. He will not leave the guilty unpunished. He uses iniquity, and that word has to do with perverting the ways of the Lord. Transgression has the idea of rebelling against God. And then sin it's literally offense, and it means missing the mark which God has set. Now all of these convey the sense of falling short of the glory of God, as Paul says in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But the truth is, all of these Israelites should have died for having broken the law of God. But God spared them in mercy. He worshiped the Lord. He pled for his presence and grace on the basis of the people's unworthiness. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary, says about these verses, before he did anything else with the tablets, God proclaimed the greatness of his attributes, a declaration that's basic to all Jewish and Christian theology. Moses repeated these words to God at Kadesh Barnea in Numbers 14. The Jews used them in Nehemiah's day, Nehemiah 9:17 and 18. Jonah quoted them when he sat pouting outside Nineveh in Jonah 4:1 and 2. So it's very important there what God said. And the revelation of God's person and character humbled Moses and caused him to kneel and worship. And as we'll see in the next section, he'll make intercession for them and plead for God's grace to be given, even though they were stiff-necked and wicked. Exodus 34:9 through 14. Beginning in verse 9, then he said, my Lord, if I have indeed found favor with you, my Lord, please go with us, even though this is a stiff-necked people. Forgive our iniquity and our sin, and accept us as your own possession. And the Lord responded, look, I'm making a covenant. In the presence of all your people, I will perform wonders that have never been done in the whole earth or in any nation. All the people you live among will see the Lord's work, for what I am doing with you is awe-inspiring. Observe what I command you today. I'm going to drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Be careful not to make a treaty with the inhabitants of the land that you're going to enter. Otherwise, they will become a snare among you. Instead, you must tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, and chop down their Asherah poles. Because the Lord is jealous for his reputation. You are never to bow down to another god. He is a jealous God. So, Moses in verse 9 pleads with God for his continued presence and mercy despite the stubbornness of the Israelites. He acknowledged his desire to find favor in God's sight, and he appeals to God's grace and kindness. He asked for God's presence to go with the Israelites, recognizing the importance of God being with them as they journey forward. He admits the stubbornness and sinfulness of the people, demonstrating a recognition of their faults. He pleads for God's forgiveness for their wrongdoing and sins, and he asks God to take the Israelites as his own possession, reaffirming their special covenant relationship with him. So this prayer here in verse 9 highlights Moses' role as an intercessor for the people, seeking God's mercy and guidance despite their imperfections. It also underscores the importance of divine presence, forgiveness, and that covenantal bond between God and his people. Well, the Lord responded, "Look, I am making a covenant." Now, that makes it sound like that it's a new covenant, but it seems that most scholars feel like that it's a renewal of the previous covenant rather than a completely new one. The original covenant was established. We studied about that last week when God gave the Ten Commandments and other laws to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. So after the incident of the golden calf, where the Israelites broke the covenant, God in his mercy here renews the covenant with Moses and the Israelites. This renewal is affirmed with new tablets containing the Ten Commandments and is marked by God's promise to perform unprecedented miracles as a sign of his continued commitment to the people. The covenant that he talks about here in verse 10 is completed down in verses 27 and 28. The Lord said to Moses, "Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." So he was there with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread or water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments here. So we see Moses being obedient to God, and the Ten Commandments which he had broke in a fit of anger now are replaced here. The Lord in verse 11 emphasizes the importance of being obedient to God's commands, and he instructs the Israelites to be diligent in following his commands and promises to drive out nations from the land that they're going to inhabit. The Amorites, Canaanites, he mentions several of them there. And that promise signifies the Lord's commitment to clearing the way for the Israelites to settle in the promised land. So again, in this verse, we see the relationship between obedience to God and the fulfillment of God's promise. And it emphasizes the need for faithfulness and trust in God's guidance. In verse 12, he says, "Be careful not to make a treaty with the inhabitants of the land that you are going to enter, otherwise they will become a snare among you." That's a crucial warning from God to the Israelites. God instructs the Israelites to avoid making covenants with the inhabitants of the land that they're going into. This was to prevent the Israelites from being influenced by the religious and cultural practices of the people, which could lead them away from worshiping the one true God. That term at the end of that verse, they will become a snare among you. Snare implies that forming such covenants would entangle the Israelites and lead them into idolatry and sin. And as we'll see, that certainly is a problem and a vulnerability that for the Israelites as they continue their relationship with God. It emphasizes the danger of compromising their unique covenant relationship with God by adopting the practices of other nations. Verse 13, he tells them to destroy the altars used by the inhabitants for worshiping their gods. And so that is an effort to eliminate these places of worship. It talks about the memorial stones. These are likely standing stones that were used in pagan worship, and God says smash them so that they can't continue to be used. He also refers to the Asherim, and that's wooden poles or trees associated with the worship of the Canaanite goddess Asherah. She was a prominent figure in Canaanite religion, revered as a mother goddess and a symbol of fertility. And so the Asherim were often placed near altars or high places, and they served as a tangible representation of the goddess there. And the worship of Asherah included rituals performed at sacred groves, Asherah poles with offerings of food, drink, and incense to secure her favor and secure fertility for the land and people. They have found artistic depictions of Asherah, often showing her alongside lions and trees and other symbols of life and strength. So cutting these down would eradicate these objects of idolatrous worship. Verse 14 reiterates the core principle of exclusive devotion to God. The commandment clearly states that the Israelites are not to worship any other gods. The term jealous here, he's a jealous God. That's used to describe God's protective zeal for his people and his covenant with them. It means that God demands exclusive worship and devotion. So his jealousy is not a negative emotion, but it's a reflection of his deep love and commitment to his people. Our lesson writer makes the point that God's jealousy is sometimes misinterpreted. Rightly understood, it shows his love and commitment to his people. Unlike human jealousy, which can stem from insecurity or selfishness, God's jealousy stems from his desire for an exclusive and intimate relationship with his creation. That's where our focal passage ends. In the rest of chapter 34, there are some things that are important. He reiterates there the institution of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that serves as a reminder of their deliverance from Egypt. He talks again about the Sabbath. You shall work 6 days, but on the seventh day You shall rest, even during plowing time and harvest. You shall rest, he says. And then he talks about the Feast of Weeks. That festival is also now known as Pentecost, and it occurs 7 weeks after the beginning of the grain harvest. Celebrates the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and it's a time of thanksgiving for the abundance of the harvest. And the third feast was the Feast of Ungathering. This is also known as the Feast of Tabernacles. In some places, I think you see it as the Feast of Booths as well. It's at the end of the agricultural year, during the autumn, and it celebrates the final gathering of the year's produce. Right at the end of the chapter, starting in verse 29, it came about when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand as he was coming down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with God. So when Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to approach him. Then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. And afterward all the sons of Israel came near, and he commanded them to do everything that the Lord had spoken to him on Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. Whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take off the veil until he came out, and when he came out and spoke to the sons of Israel what he had been commanded, the sons of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone. So Moses put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with him. So, what do we learn from our lesson this week? Our perception of God ought to be influenced by his deep affection for us, his grace and mercy that we've seen so vividly displayed in this lesson. And this passage emphasizes our need to put worship of God first in our lives because of who he is. And it serves as a warning against idolatry in every form. And idolatry can come in many forms, not just with graven images. We should recognize and eliminate things that take our focus away from God as we believe and trust in him. God's great love for us should affect deeply how we feel about him, causing us to honor and worship him alone. As believers in Jesus, we should readily turn away from anything that might get in the way of our praise of the one true God. All of our heart, soul, mind, and strength should be focused on God with a sincere devotion and adoration that aims to serve him in every part of our lives. The jealous love of God, that's our lesson title. It should profoundly influence how we act, causing us to commit intentionally and wholeheartedly to loving God above all else. Today's passage shows that God wants his people to worship him exclusively, and he wants the world to see him and his works so that they may know him and believe. It's a good reminder to us. Next week, we'll move on to, I believe it's chapter 40. So come back next week and we'll see you then. Thank you.